What is it like to be attacked by a serial killer, to fight for your life, and then survive to tell the story?
We always have an odd one in the crowd.
So it's kind of odd.
Decidedly odd.
Doesn't that strike you as a little bit odd?
No, that doesn't strike me as a little bit odd.
It's the Bob and Sheri Oddcast, with stuff we wouldn't, couldn't, or shouldn't do on the regular show. Now, here's the Oddcast.
People Magazine Investigates has an incredible new series out called Surviving a Serial Killer. You can watch it on Investigation Discovery, and it's also streaming on Max. Joining us on this episode of the Oddcast, and the next few actually, because we're going to take a deep dive into these stories, is People Magazine's editorial director, Alicia Dennis. And we are going to kick it off by talking about the survivor of the dating game killer.
He's a skydiver, so he's got a lot of nerve. He's into motorcycling. He's also a fine photographer. Say hello to Rodney Alcala. Rodney, come on and say hello.
When I think about what it must mean to look back and realize how close you came to being annihilated by a serial killer, I don't even have a guess at what kind of burden that is to carry, Alicia. So let's talk about the very first episode of Surviving a Serial Killer, and we'll talk about the dating game killer.
Yeah, it's exactly what you said, Sheri. Working on this series has been so eye-opening to see the strength and the resilience of the survivors that have been willing to talk to us and to share with us, you know, the most horrible moments of their lives that they have continued to live through over and over again. And in the case of Rodney Alcala, the dating game killer, we talked to a woman by the name of Morgan Rowan, who was just a teenager when she was attacked by this guy. And the reason he was called the dating game killer, I don't know if you remember this was back when reality television was brand new in the 1960s and early 70s, and they had a show called The Dating Game.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And you know what amazes me, Alicia, is that with the proliferation of reality TV show, I'm not convinced that history isn't going to show us a serial killer on at least one season of The Bachelor. Like, it's just statistically, right? It seems impossible that Alcala was the only one to show up on television. But go on.
Wow, you've scared me. Now I'm afraid. I just keep thinking that hopefully all of our vetting tools and the way that people their backgrounds are looked into and that kind of thing is so much better than it was in the late 60s, early 70s. But anyway, yes, he was such a charming person that he managed to convince producers, television crew that he needed to be on the show, which was a bachelorette would come onto the stage and there would be a screen between her and three bachelors. And she would ask questions like, Bachelor number one, if we went on a date, where would we go? And things like this. And she would pick her winner based on the answers to those questions. And then there would be the big reveal at the end of the show where she would meet who it was that won. And the studio would pay for them to go out on a date. Anyway, he not only got on this show, he won the date. He was that guy. He was that charismatic.
Well, that's the thing about many of these serial killer perpetrators. You know, we have this idea in our head of like a kind of this deviant monster, but let's take a look. I mean, a guy like Ted Bundy, for example, the very essence of charisma and charm. So
Right.
we shouldn't leap to the conclusion that you can spot a person, a predator like this, just based on outward cues. Right?
You're absolutely right. Right. And
your serial killers are very cunning and very strategic as a rule, are they not?
They are, as a rule. Obviously, there's going to be variations from any kind of pattern here and there. You know, you're going to have the person who is charismatic and charming and lures people in to their lives and their circles. And then you're going to have people that are more loners and maybe societal outcasts who are targeting their victims in a very random way. So you see both of that psychology going on when you look at these cases. But with Rodney Alcala, he was one of the people that was just the charismatic, charming one. And for Morgan Rowan, who encountered him in 1965, he attacked her and she somehow managed to survive that encounter. And afterwards had what we see often happen with victims is this a massive amount of blame of herself, this self-hatred and self-blame, that this was my fault somehow.
Guilt. Yeah.
I shouldn't have been there, or I shouldn't have done that.
Well, and the culture reinforces that. Well, why were you out at night? What were you wearing? Did you lead him on? Did you give him the impression? Like, it is so, we are brutal as a culture on victims. And that was even worse when Morgan was attacked back in 1965. Yeah.
Yes.
What's your best time?
The best time is at nighttime.
What's wrong with morning, afternoon?
Well, they're okay, but nighttime's when it really gets good.
As shocking and really terrifying as it is to imagine that Morgan Rowan survived the dating game killer, didn't he come for her a second time?
He did.
He did.
No, you're right. You're right. He absolutely did. And so, what she had done is hidden this almost even from herself. She'd hidden it from her parents. Her friends happened to know about the attack because they did help her escape the first time that he attacked her. And, she just tamped down the memories as much as she could. She tried to move on with her life. And then I think it was about 3 years later, she was attacked again by him, somehow manages to survive again. And I'm pretty sure that part of the reason she was attacked a second time is he realized that he had left a surviving witness to the things that he was doing. And he knew that if she ever did have enough bravery to come forward with her story, that it could be a problem for him to continue in this awful, secret, evil double life that he had. And so I think she was targeted. I mean, I think the first time it might have been just an opportunity for him to attack her. And I think the second time he was coming for her, I believe.
And to survive that twice.
It's just hard to wrap your brain around. I mean, it's hard to wrap your brain around it even once, but twice. And certainly for Morgan, what we find too, Sheri, when we talk to these survivors and victims, is that this is something that doesn't go away for them ever, even if they have therapy and they feel that they've healed to some degree and they've built their lives back. Just out of the blue, these memories can come back to haunt them unexpectedly. A sight, a smell, a song, a color, something that they see, a car pass can make them remember and take them right back to these awful, awful moments of their lives. And so with Morgan, it's taken her decades to come to the place of wanting to share this in a public way and wanting to be part of this episode and part of our show. And we try to make it really incredibly clear that this is going to be so hard to do, right? We're going to ask you to sit down and talk to us on camera about this experience. We're going to take you back many times to the place where it happened. And it's going to be covered in People Magazine. It's going to be covered on people.com. It's going to be on Investigation Discovery. It's going to stream on Max. There's going to be millions of people that know this story. Are you sure that you're ready? Because we want to take our cues from survivors, because this truly is their story. They are having this moment of being able to take it back for themselves. And it's amazing to me, the strength that Morgan has, that she was able to do it.
I've seen in other cases where survivors of these horrific brutal crimes, there seems to be a little bit of a catharsis in finally telling the story. It's like this painful, shameful thing that I've carried inside me, that I could not suppress or bury or ever forget. It's almost counterintuitive the way telling the shameful thing strips it of some of the power that it holds. And I wonder if that was true for Morgan after talking about her experience.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think that that's some commonality that we see when people are able to share it in that way. And I think you're right in, too, that she's being able to put it behind her to some degree by talking about what occurred. And I also think that there is a part of her and a part of many of these survivors that we've talked to that believe that by sharing this, they're going to help someone else, that somewhere out there, there's a victim who feels alone. There's somebody who feels afraid to talk. There's somebody who feels guilt and shame. And by realizing that someone else has experienced something not exactly the same as you, but similar to what you've been through, you're not alone in these feelings, that it is going to help them too, you know?
Well, one of the sort of quandaries about true crime reporting and true crime entertainment, which, you know, we have to say that for many people it's entertainment, is this idea that the star of the show is the perpetrator and the victims are the scenery. And that is truly problematic and I think re-traumatizing. And what's different here with what Surviving a Serial Killer is doing is you're flipping that narrative. And now it's no longer Rodney Alcala's story, it's Morgan's story. And she is the narrator, she is the main character. And it's putting the correct perspective on the events. That instead of this being some sensationalistic, ooh, oh my goodness, can you believe how scary and terrible? It flips it completely and it puts him in the back seat, which is something that, you know, just in general in culture, pop culture, we know the names of all the perpetrators, but we struggle to know the names of their victims. And this changes that completely. It flips it.
It absolutely does. You're completely right. And I believe too that in this particular episode that we're talking about now, there's also another survivor who appears in this episode. This is a woman who was just an 8-year-old girl when she was kidnapped by Rodney Alcala and when she was attacked by him. And she manages years later to face him in court and is part of the reason that he was brought to justice at all. She and Morgan have actually formed a bond and a friendship and are there for each other. And in a way, they are the only people, these survivors of this specific guy, Rodney Alcala, who can completely relate to what it was like to go through that with him. You know, what he was like, how creepy he was. You know, Morgan talks about the level of charisma that he had and charm, where in one moment he would be the guy next door telling jokes and funny in the life of the party and somebody who you would trust to pick up your mail or walk your dog, you know, somebody who you just felt like you were friends with right away. And then in seconds, there would be this switch that would flip where you would be face to face with a monster, a blank-faced person who, you know, the charming guy from moments ago had disappeared, and you're looking almost at the eyes of a shark. There's no feeling behind them. There's no person behind them. And you're truly, you know, this is the monster version, and you can't reach to the human person that you had just been speaking to. And that is just a nightmare to even imagine. But the fact that Morgan can has this experience that, she and this other survivor are able to help one another through when there's a bad day or a particularly awful memory. And I think that's remarkable,
In the case of Rodney Alcala, that ability to shapeshift, from charming, affable, good-looking guy, right, into just cold, flat, zero affect predator. I mean, in some ways, he was perfect for the dating game. If you think about it, it's almost like you had to write this as a fictional story. It's almost unbelievable that this is a thing that actually happened, because he had to get through the screening and the casting process to be one of the bachelors on the dating game. And a predator like Alcala, he's got natural camouflage. He knows how to adjust his behavior, his body language, his speech to fit whatever environment he's in at the moment. It's what makes someone like that so deadly.
Exactly. And he was a chameleon, somebody who, what you're saying is exactly right with him, where he could read a room, he could be whoever you wanted him to be, he could, shapeshift in a way and be the perfect bachelor for the show and be this, engaging guy and make it so that people felt comfortable and people trusted him. And he also, would tell people that he was a photographer, and he would ask people to let him take their picture and, I'm going to make you famous. And there was that part of him that was putting a camera between him and sometimes a would-be victim, where he had a mask that he could put on where he could charm them up to the point of them agreeing to be part of a photo shoot or agree to letting him take pictures. And then he could put the camera between the two of them where they wouldn't necessarily see what was going on the other side of the camera. And what's really chilling is when people looked further into this case, when authorities finally did capture him and when he was finally arrested, and they went and looked into his home and found a storage unit that was rented in his name, authorities found thousands of photographs of women, many of whom they could not identify and did not know whether these women were alive or dead. So at the time,
God, that's so chilling to think about.
Right. And at the time that first occurred, when he was first arrested, we worked with police to put up a lot of those photographs, to put them in People magazine, to put them online on people.com to see if there was anyone out there who could recognize any of them and give the police any information about them.
So before we leave Morgan's case, before we leave the dating game killer behind, what was your, in meeting with these survivors and hearing their stories and seeing how they've processed and gone forward, what was your big takeaway after spending that time with Morgan? What would you say has been the thing that has propelled her forward and given her the resilience that she's needed in order to get to this place today?
It's a good question. I feel that it's remarkable to me that someone like Morgan, who for years believed she was weak and believed that somehow she was to blame and was overwhelmed with guilt and shame, that she didn't see her own strength. She wasn't aware of it. It was the fact that she's even alive today is because of her strength and resilience. And she didn't recognize it in herself. And it really took all these years of her processing this trauma to be able to see her own strength and to be able to say, yeah, I am strong. And that's a revelation, really, and something that is endlessly, surprising to me that people just don't even know how strong they are, even if we can look at them and tell them and say to them, we see it, this is part of who you are. You're an incredibly strong person. And they're only, feeling the weakness and feeling the guilt. I think another thing that stands out to me is the guilt that survivors feel for surviving, and that sometimes they feel, because why did they survive when so many others didn't? In the case of Rodney Alcala, police believe that he could have killed up to 120 victims, which is, how can you even wrap your brain around that? And Morgan feels like if she had spoken earlier, could she have saved someone else? Why did she survive when others didn't? And now she's being able to live that part of her life where she can stand tall and know that she's done everything that she could, that she's connected, with other survivors. And I hope that when people do learn about her story and read about her or watch her or see this show, that they are inspired by her as well, because I definitely am.
Let's go to just one of my favorite places. We've had a long time relationship with Lexington, Kentucky. Our radio show has been carried there for just a gazillion years. It's a beautiful place. Kentucky is just one of the most beautiful states in the country. Lexington is such a cool town. It's a horse town. It's a bourbon town. It's a booming, thriving, really exciting place to live. And it's also the location of an absolutely horrific serial killer crime, the railroad killer. And now he was convicted, I believe, for 9, but as is typical with serial murderers, the authorities suspect that there were many, many more victims that they have not been able to connect. But there is one survivor of the railroad killer in Lexington, Kentucky, and her name is Holly Dean. Tell me about Holly.
Holly was a college student in Kentucky when this encounter occurred, and she was out with her boyfriend at the time. This was a case of being just in the most tragically wrong place at the wrong time, because the railroad killer, Angel Reséndiz, he was someone who was called that because he was riding railroad cars and getting off at random cities and attacking just who he would see. It wasn't any kind of, connection.
And Alicia, you alluded to this when we first started chatting, that some of these killings are so very random, and it's almost more terrifying to think of the randomness of this, because he was not just in the United States, but Reséndiz was Mexico, Canada. He was crisscrossing. He'd get on, he'd get off. He literally just was like, well, I think I'll stretch my legs. And if you had the grave misfortune of being in the place where he jumped off that train, that was it. He wasn't stalking a particular victim. There was nothing that these individuals could have done to protect themselves from being targeted by this man.
Right. It was just, very incredibly random and no connection at all, just as you say. And I don't know what's scarier, Sheri, when you mention that, if it's someone that you know or is a friend of a friend or someone inside your circles who's a serial killer, or someone that you randomly encounter as, I don't know which is more horrifying and scary, because when you think about it, there's kind of no list of things you should and shouldn't do to protect yourself. In a way, there's just no way to protect yourself.
When they were looking for him, he had so many aliases. I remember he was Rafael Reséndiz Ramirez, and then they said he was Angel Reséndiz, and he was hard to track down because of that too.
Exactly. And on top of that, when you talk about just the wide range of all these different crime scenes, he was jumping on railroad cars, as Sheri mentioned before, and even across the country. So you're looking at from California to Florida, killings that were happening, that how in the world can police even connect them to one another? Because when you look at a killing and a murder scene, one of the first things that authorities are doing are they're trying to find out information about the victim. Who did they know? Who were they connected to? Who, in their circle had any kind of issue with them? All that kind of investigation goes in right at the beginning. And, there have been shows that have talked about the first 48 hours of an investigation is when you find out a lot of times who the killer is. That's who you know. And authorities had all kinds of disadvantages here because this guy wasn't targeting anyone he knew, and he wasn't necessarily part of any of these communities at all. And by the time, clues were turning cold, he was somewhere else killing again. It's just so hard to piece these things together.
His behavior, when I think about a nightmare killer, I think about a man who jumps off the tracks at random, follows you home, kills you with a rock or a pickaxe or whatever big heavy object is handy, then heads into the kitchen to eat because this is what he did in his victim's home. Then, he sends your jewelry to his wife and mom back home. And he takes your driver's license because as your body is lying there getting cold, he's curious about you. Oh, look, green eyes. It's not, this is like something in a human suit. It's hard for me to reconcile this man's behavior with a human being's behavior.
Right. It's definitely a monster walking amongst us. And it was almost as if he looked at this as a job. He was going to go and rob people in this way, as you say, send their personal belongings back home to support his family. And this was just all in a day's work for him.
So Holly, a college student, I want you to imagine yourself at that age, right? Encountering this. This is not a person. This is a demon in a person suit. There is no reasoning. There is no pleading. There's no negotiating. And she manages to be the only person who survives this encounter.
She is. And the fact that she and, her boyfriend were together, that he showed no hesitancy in attacking the both of them. It wasn't, her alone being a target, walking along, near a place that she shouldn't have. It was none of that. It was, just she and her boyfriend out on a particular day and, running into this, as you say, a demon in a human suit. She somehow manages to survive the attack and believes, off and on throughout her coming to and losing consciousness in and out of consciousness that she is dead. There are moments that she's, confused about whether or not, she's even alive anymore. Holly, you would think that after surviving something like that it would be really easy to withdraw from life and to want to be completely disconnected from a case like this. And even though it did affect her college career, of course, she did need to go home and recover. She wasn't able to immediately return to classes. She did eventually, but she was so engaged in solving this case that she's part of the reason that he was ever brought to justice. She worked with authorities. She talked to authorities. She did everything she could to honor the memory of her boyfriend who did not survive the attack. Meeting with his family, trying to bring justice about not only for herself and not only for the other victims, but for him. And Holly has gone on, it surprises me too so often, is she's gone on to dedicate her life to helping other victims, you would imagine that if something this horrific happened in your life, that you might not want to ever talk about it, and you certainly might not want to live it every day in helping somebody else. But she somehow does that. She started a nonprofit advocacy center because what she was finding is every time she was having to describe the attack over and over again, that sometimes it would happen on the same day. She would tell one police officer, and then she'd need to tell another police officer, and then a detective would come in, she'd need to tell that person. And she imagined, what if these vulnerable victims would have a place, a safe place to come where they could tell their story once, and I would bring all the authorities into this safe place. All of them could come in at the same time, listen to this victim describe this once to them all. How much would that help them? And she was only able to see this because she was a victim herself, or a survivor herself. And so she knew intimately exactly what it is that people need in those moments. She knew, of course, in the most horrific way possible to know, but she knew, and instead of running away from knowing, she used knowing to make it better for other people.
It's really, her story is really extraordinary in so many ways, because you're right. Who knows better how re-traumatizing this experience is than the person who survived it?
Mm-hmm.
You know, who knows better? And again, you know, to circle back, in our culture, victims of rape and sexual assault are themselves on trial very often, you know,
Yes.
for their choices and their behavior, and, you know, what they did and did not do before, during, and after. And
Yes.
so who better to understand that than someone who has lived it so brutally? And if, for people listening who are not really familiar with Holly's case, not only did her boyfriend, Chris, not survive the attack, he was murdered next to her. She witnessed that. And then she herself was attacked repeatedly. And it's a miracle that she's alive today. So when you think about what that trauma is and what that experience is, and then having to be told, okay, start at the beginning over and over again, it's shocking. It's shocking when you realize that's just how we do things. That's just how it goes.
Well, yeah, that's how it works. That's how we get to the justice part of it. And we are glad for people that are willing to tell that story over and over again. A lot of times, you know, I don't know that people have thought about what that's doing to them. Just give me more, remember more, tell me more about that, tell me more about what he looked like, what he sounded like. Let's sketch it, let's think about it. And we want them to be able to do that so that we can go and catch the perpetrators, of course. At the same time, are we taking the care that we need to for the person that is having to relive this in such detail in order to catch these monsters?
I mean, you really have to be in awe of someone like Holly Dunn. You really do, who not only had the courage to bring this perpetrator to justice, but who has made it her life's work to be standing side by side with other victims as they come forward to seek justice. I mean, what finer way to live your life than that?
It's amazing to me. She just really is amazing. And, you know, I have not had a great deal of trauma in my own life personally. But when there are moments of something small, like you had a fender bender or something like that happen, you spend a lot of time going, oh, I wish I hadn't have taken that route today, or oh, I wish I hadn't have gone out right at that particular time, or if it hadn't have been raining, then you know that wouldn't have happened. And this is that times infinity, which happens to these victims. Like, if we hadn't have gone for a walk, if we had just stayed inside when he said he wanted to study, if, you know, we had just gone to the coffee shop instead of taking a walk there, if I had tied my shoes longer, then maybe I would have not been there at that particular time. I mean, the things that go through your mind as you're wishing it away and looking back and saying, if only, if only, if only. And it can cripple people their entire lives. The if onlys of those horrific moments that someone loses a life and someone, you know, his life is changed forever. And she's helping people figure out a way through the endless if onlys that torture people on top of the memories of the actual assault.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Oddcast. We're going to continue covering some of these stories with People Magazine's editorial director, Alicia Dennis. You can watch the show Surviving a Serial Killer on Investigation Discovery, and it's streaming on Max. And we so appreciate you joining us for this one. Our website is BOBANDSHERI.com. Trust your instincts, be careful out there, be safe, and we'll see you on the next Oddcast.